Welcome to Moonbeaming, a podcast about magic, creativity, the tarot, lunar living, and more. I'm your host, Sarah Faith Gottesdiener, and I'm so happy you're here. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. I'm so glad you're here. If you're just joining us for the first time, my name is Sarah Faith Gottesdiener. I'm an artist, an intuitive, a business owner, a tarot reader, and author of The Moon Book, a book about changing your life and living in your trust, connected to intuition and self-compassion and love and spirit and witchcraft and all kinds of other things. It's a good book. You should pick it up. On this show, I talk about human stuff, magic stuff, energy stuff, life, love, the pursuit of our best selves, a whole lot of other captivating, interesting stuff. That reminds me, it's so silly. There's a silly joke that my sweetie and I have. We're pretty corny. One of our running jokes is that one day we'll have a store called Stuff and Things. And that was partially in response to living in Portland, Oregon, where every store has a name like Bee and Stinger, or Anchor and Ocean, or Sage and Stamen, or whatever. You get the idea. Maybe it's just Portland, or is this like a store name thing? Store names? Store owners? Can you let me know? Anyway, I digress. It'll be called Stuff and Things. I'll open it about 50 years. You're all invited to the opening. I'm digressing though, so let's get on to this week's show. First, I get to announce the winner of the June tarot reading giveaway. Every month on Moonbeaming, we give out a prize for folks leaving 5-star reviews. It doesn't matter when you leave them. It could be from a year ago. It could be from a week ago. We pick them randomly. And this month's winner is Nymphheart. Nymphheart, you are the winner of a 30-minute tarot reading with me. And the wonderful review that Nymphheart wrote back in February is, "An anti-capitalist mindset is an abundance mindset," was a huge and needed reframe for me. As an anti-capitalist, disabled queer witch, this podcast makes me feel seen and never fails to give me timely and much-needed wisdom to navigate a society that pushes people to the margins. Sarah's soothing voice, thank you, can reach you where you are, no matter where you are in your practice. I find it especially perfect for listening on walks while I ground myself to my environment. The focused review on archetypal themes of the Tarot Bowl of the Week is a big bonus. I cannot recommend more heartily. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Nymphheart, please contact moonbeamingpodcast@gmail.com or the studio so we can set up your reading sometime soon. And thank you to everyone for leaving reviews. It helps people find us. This is totally a DIY podcast. If you would like to sponsor us, you can write us at moonbeamingpodcast@gmail. Thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands listen to the show each week, and it's a great way to get the word out to a wonderful community about your store, your project, or the services that you offer. So find out more. Be in touch. Would love to have you as a sponsor on the show. Okay. All right, friends. We've got a guest this week. Our guest is renowned master astrologer Rick Levine. I knew that when I started this show, I wanted to talk to Rick. I have about a list of probably 100 or 200 people that I want to talk to. So don't worry. This podcast will probably be going on for quite a while. And Rick was on that list. There are so many reasons. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you know who Rick Levine is, listening, of course, because he's a bit of a living legend. He's a co-founder of Kepler University. In fact, he named it. His forecasts on YouTube get like over 40,000 views each month. He's been an astrologer since 1976 and has written daily horoscopes for 20 years. Another is that he's been an astrologer for so long, and also he's still really enthralled and interested in it, as well as being open to new ideas, new ways of practicing, and new voices. You know, a friend of mine who's also an astrologer told me astrologers only get younger as they age. And I think Rick is a prime example of that phenomenon. In this interview, he talks about how he keeps it fresh, stays young at heart, and there's a lot of good advice in there for all of us. Another thing I do want to share with y'all is after our chat, Rick quickly looked up my chart and he showed me something there, an aspect. I haven't had one person that's looked at my chart as ever named or talked about. And in like, it was like in a 5-minute period, it explains something about me that I've never been able to put into words, and something that frankly felt isolating and like a wound. And when he spoke about it, I felt like there was a purpose to this, and a purpose to this weird part of me. And I actually started crying. I know, shocking, right? But actually I don't cry that much, especially not in front of people I don't know that well and I admire. But Rick, to his credit, was such a kind sweetie about it. So that's just to say he's incredibly, incredibly gifted. Truly a master astrologer with a ton of wisdom for the collective. We talk about so much in this interview. There's so much to think about. We talk about time loops and astrology, chicken or egg, and astrological interpretations, what Rick strives for in his work as a consulting astrologer, in his horoscope writing practice. And of course, he recites a lot of poetry, because why not? Why not? If you've memorized a lot of poetry, why not recite it when you can? I think I know about like 3 poems, and Rick knows like 3,000. So that was that. So it's really, really good. It's fun. There's a lot of information. Rick has a lot of wisdom to share, and I just really hope you enjoy it. So without further ado, my friends, I present to you a conversation that I had with Rick Levine in the beginning of 2021. Hello, 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 Rick. Welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you on. I want to take a minute to reflect to you how I see you, like how I experience you. I experience you as someone who has been doing this work for so long, who is so committed, and yet is also so incredibly open, so incredibly interested in new ideas, so incredibly excited and engaged in your work and in community and like the greater whole. Someone who's humble, incredibly brilliant, and just really incredible at churning out output. Like, you are a content machine. Yeah.
Here I am. Would you say that at my funeral, whenever that may be? That's like, I felt like I died. That's
well, I mean, I just really admire you. I think that I think personally, as someone who looks forward to becoming an elder, I think elders are incredibly important, especially elders who are so open, experimental, engaged, always trying to learn. And we're going to talk about that in the interview. But before I start asking you questions, would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners?
In doing that, I remember Ram Dass once talking about being at a psychology, what do you call it, like a symposium where he was the subject. And so normally you have people that, like ask questions or whatever. But here he was back from India sitting cross-legged in the middle of a, conference room table. And he basically introduced himself as the subject, so to speak. And so I feel like I have to somehow introduce myself. You said I've been doing astrology for a long time. I've tried to figure out how long. I think it was about 2,200 years. Because my initial introduction to astrology was my dad went to the Mediterranean on a business trip, and I studied at the feet of Pythagoras.
That was in your past life. That was like 300 past lives ago about.
Well, actually, it's funny you should say that, because I am of the absolute conviction that past lives are just a bunch of crap. And I'll tell you why. Not because they don't exist, but because they don't exist in the past. Because everything that's ever happened and everything that ever will happen is happening right now. The time as a linear function is this magnificent, wonderful illusion that our reptile brain creates to give us the illusion of cause and effect in the mesocosm, in the reality between the very small and the very large. And so past life, I totally get the concept. And yes, I do believe that there was some connection that I had then and at various other times in the past and in the future, but they're not in the past. By remembering them, they are in the present.
So what I hear you saying is that your actual middle name is Merlin.
Yes, but it wasn't given to me at birth. My name given to me at birth was Michael. And although I love the name Michael, this is my middle name, I love the name Michael, I never, ever, even as a kid, from the first time, like in third or fourth grade, when I had to write my name was never Richard, which is my full first name. It was never Richard Michael Levine. It was always Richard M. Levine. I never used Michael ever once. And about 25 years ago or so, maybe a little bit more than that now, God, on a divorce, as you may know if you've ever been through that process, that most states allow the woman to recapture her maiden name without an extra court fee. And so at a divorce, there's a document that you file for a name change. It's like a get out of jail free card. And friends and loves and computer clients. I've been doing a lot of work in the computer magical realms there, in the astrology realms. Everybody always referred to me as the wizard or as Merlin. And when email began back for me, I was a very early adopter. I think I was on AOL in the mid 80s and early mid 80s. And I had an email address, I think probably by 90 probably. But the point is that even in that realm where you had to have a nickname or a handle in the chat rooms, it was nothing like now. I just always used Merlin. And there's a lot of people who know me as Merlin who have no idea that I have another name. But when I got divorced in, when was it? Like 1994, I think it was. I did the papers myself. I stood in front of the judge, and the judge kind of like, I was the only person in the courtroom, but he was like raised up above me, like about by 2 feet. And he's looking down at me and he's going, okay, let's see. This seems to be in order. The dissolution agreement. Okay. No. And is your wife changing her name? Okay. Yes, she is. And so are you. And I said, yes, Your Honor, I'm reclaiming my maiden name from a former lifetime.
What was the expression on that judge's face like?
I'll do it exactly as he did it. It was like, it was this. He looked down at the paper. He looked at me. He looked down at the paper. He looked at me and he went, whatever. And he signed it.
He was like, I got lunch. He's like, I don't have time to figure this guy out.
So on my passport and on my driver's license, my legal middle name is Merlin. And there are still a lot of people in my life and a lot of very close friends who just, call me Merlin. And it just seems natural. I've always had an affinity, not just to the quasi-historical Merlin, whether it's Once and Future King or the Mary Zimmer Bradley books, the Forest House and the Mists of Avalon and all of that. But I've had, even as a young kid, I was always fascinated by anything that broke the laws of science. I mean, it was like a Uranian. I have Uranus in the first house. When people ask me what my sign is, I have no planets in Aquarius, but my answer is typically I'm an Aquariarian because I have 4 planets and the North Node in Aries in the 11th house. I have Uranus rising in Gemini, and I have an Aquarius midheaven. So, and it kind of hides the fact that I'm really a wuss and I have a Cancer moon. But the idea of the Uranian attraction to anything, hypnotism, psychic powers, UFOs, and wizardry, magic. I loved magic. If I was more dexterous, I would have become a stage magician. I read books on it and I practiced as a kid, and yeah, I could do a few tricks, but like nothing to make a living at. But then I began to realize that stage magic was really just a bunch of clever things, and that there was real magic, and I wanted in on that.
So the real magic you practice is astrology. What kind of astrology do you practice predominantly?
No, the real magic I practice, astrology is a symptom of, it's a fragment of the real magic I practice. The real magic I practice is I can create the illusion of bending space and time. That's the magic. The magic is that when we see a client, we actually have the power, whether we're aware of it or not. What we're doing is we're altering the space-time fabric. And that's real magic. That's where magic happens. And so astrology is a way in. It's a tool.
Let's take a step back. I want to pin something you said. You said when astrologers are with clients, they're bending the space-time continuum.
Continuum.
You didn't say bend. You said something else. Did you say?
Yeah, I used the word bend or alter, where we're doing magic. We're changing the nature of time.
So talk about how astrology changes the nature of time, particularly when we're going to get into your forecasts and your overviews. I'm really curious about that. I'm curious about when you sit with a client and talk to them about their chart and transits, how is that bending and changing and impacting time?
Well, because when people walk into my office or walk into my Zoom room or whatever these days, they have a particular set of responsibilities and pressures on them, and whether it's spouse or parents or children or job or an appointment at 7:30 or whatever it is, they have all these things that are based upon the linear timeline in which they live. And they come into my space, and all of a sudden that's gone. There's a wonderful poem. It actually was never intended as a poem. It's a short little blip by one of my favorite poets. And I should tell you that if I didn't have to make a living doing astrology, I would just write poetry and read it and study it, because poetry to me is where music meets language. And again, poetry alters the time-space continuum, because it brings the mind into other places. But Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote, and I get this close, I probably should have it in front of me. I used to have it on my wall. He wrote, "What if you dreamed? And what if in your dream you went to heaven? And what if in your dream you found yourself in a garden? And what if in your dream you plucked a beautiful flower from that garden? And what if, when you awoke, you held that flower in your hand? What then?"
That's beautiful.
So my goal when I see a client is to meet them in Rumi's field, in a place that's outside of their normal pressures of what they are doing. And we go into this dream space where what happened 17 years ago and what happened 31 years ago and what's going on right now somehow all of a sudden seem crystal clear, the same thing, although they're fragmented over Saturn cycles or Uranus cycles or whatever. And my goal when I see a client is to send them on their way with a flower from this impossible dream space that when they get home, they set it on their nightstand by their bed and they confront it or it confronts them. That reminds them of the magic that they can touch, but often have excluded themselves from because of the pressures of living in a linear world. When I was in college, someone asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I said, and I was like 19 or 20. And I said, I want to be an nth dimensional spy in linear land. That's what I said as a late teen. And that's what I am. I trick people into going into other spaces that don't make sense to them. And then they end up having something that they have to deal with and put their life in perspective with that. So that's kind of the short version of that story.
How does that influence your philosophy or your worldview? Like, what's the weaving in between the dreaming and the bending of time and the being a guide into different realms, a guide to one's potentials, I would say, maybe blueprint, like how has this practice of astrology supported your worldview or your particular philosophies?
Yeah, that's a really good question, but it begs the which came first, the chicken or the egg. Did my astrology support this worldview, or did the worldview manifest and support the astrology? Because there are people who do astrology in very different ways than I do. I have a thing that when I'm teaching students, I basically, because I do a lot of law in many of my classes, I use the charts of people in the class as the curriculum rather than using a textbook. And every chart has material that becomes useful teaching material. And I often will tell my students, but I do the same thing with my clients. And that is, I've never met anyone clever enough to get me to answer a yes/no question. And I have astrologer friends that go, well, what do you mean? That's what I do for a living. And I tell them, well, you're the answer astrologer. I'm the question astrologer, because I believe, and it's something that I learned when I was 18, 19 years old from a philosophy professor in college. This guy, his teaching was the search creates the reality. When we stop looking, we stop manufacturing reality. We become stagnant. I mean, everyone we know has lost a friend to Shoshuran Buddhism, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, or Dianetics, or Scientology.
Like all my friends.
or Jesus, or Vajrayana Buddhism, or something that's amazing, but it captures their mind and they stop growing, and I'm not saying all of those things stop everyone from growing.
I hear you.
But there's something
the
about
dogmatic or being involved in something that tells you what the world is. And, that explains everything.
When you accept Jesus Christ as your savior, you don't have to look anymore. You don't have to ask any more questions. And when someone asks me a question, I often say, I get, like an email, I'm going through a particularly strange period of time and I need to know whether or not I should get married or get divorced or buy this home or whatever. And I say, I think you've got the wrong person because I think you're looking for the answer astrologer. I'm the question astrologer. And this is not an excuse for poor astrology. I will help you understand the nature of all of the things that are interacting on this moment, and will include in that the history of similar moments where you've reacted in a way that maybe didn't work as well as you wanted to, and we'll look at all of that. But the problem with me answering your question is this: I'm a really good answer giver. I know how to give answers.
Clearly, you are like rocking these answers, Rick.
But here's the problem. If I give you a good answer, you got my answer, not your answer. And everyone comes from different perspectives. When someone says, should I do this? I know astrologers who say that they're neutral, but they bring to the moment their biases, their orientations, their training, their worldview, their cultural, perspectives, and so on. And so when I give you an answer, if it's a good answer, it stops your process. And that's the last thing I want to do for a client. I don't care whether the decision they make is right or wrong. I care whether it's a better decision than the one that they might have made if they didn't think about it. And for that matter, I don't care whether I'm right or wrong when I'm saying something about someone's chart, because I don't want to be right. I just want to be useful. There's no place for ego in doing this work. It's not about that. Anyhow, rant over.
So, well, this is an interview, so I am encouraging you to talk.
Oh, you have no idea. I could go for 3 or 4 days without,
Hey,
breath.
We've got a lot to talk about. So would you say your worldview is like to always be seeking, to stay humble, to always be learning? Like, you got a little cagey. You didn't quite answer. Is your worldview or your philosophy, is it just always changing?
My worldview has some very, very basic underpinnings, but one of them is that I know that I don't know. And furthermore, if you know, I know that you don't know either. This isn't about being ignorant. It's about understanding the nature of reality, because reality is not as we perceive it. And our worldview is always what prevents us from making decisions that we didn't know that they were available. And so, yes, I'm always eager to have someone blow my mind and have me go, holy crap, that changes everything. That to me is a wonderful date,
So on that topic, I had a question I wanted to ask you, and this is the right time to ask you because it is this chicken or egg question I've been thinking about going nowhere with. To be very frank with you, the astrology I've had to learn is just a byproduct of my job. Like I'm not an astrologer. I don't have any learned knowledge other than just having to read enough to I know the basics because I've had to, right? In like Western astrology, but I'm pretty interested also in sidereal. But anyway, I've had this chicken or egg question about astrology, which I hope you could talk about. I wonder if you've wondered about. I don't want to sound too naive too, so please just bear with me. There's this connection, right? We know there's this connection between the cosmos and us, and we know that astrology is a symbolic language, right? It's one of many symbolic languages. And so we know that the language we use, or the archetypes we use, or the language we use to describe planets, stars, transits, like so on and so forth, can potentially shape our interpretation of those things in real time, right? So my question, you're like, okay, yeah,
no, this is good.
I'm covering my bases. So, if we changed the way we talked about, interpreted, and viewed the cosmos and the symbolic language of the cosmos, would humanity change? Like, what's the link between the symbolic language of astrology and human culture?
My answer, I think, is yes, it would change. And yes, it has changed. And yes, it continually changes. But we run into this problem that Dr. Siggy, who I know is terribly politically incorrect in so many people's minds, but people don't understand. People don't understand the result or what Freud's work was. They go, oh, he got it wrong. No, he opened up the door to everything that followed. Without his book that he wrote during the time of the of the Neptune, every 400 years, Neptune, the planet of dreams and imagination, lines up with Pluto, the underworld that comes up. They align every 400 years, and they did in the 1890s. And it was during that moment in time that Freud wrote The Interpretation of Dreams, which basically started his path down the road that led to every type of depth psychology that we have in the West, including everything that's transpersonal, that's James Hillman, that's Carl Jung, that's Maslow. And it doesn't matter what the psychology it is. It all goes back there. And he laid a groundwork and a framework to that. And so this is one of the things that is one of my underpinnings, is the understanding of the nature of the subconscious, the unconscious, and its relationship to the hell realms, or the spaces between life and death, or life and rebirth. And in fact, the Bardo states in the Tibetan system, that these are all interrelated, and that Freud actually was the first Westerner without the system of the Eastern mechanics, of the Eastern psychologies, if you will. He basically pushed like a Taurus up against this outward flow of energy and worked his way backward into this space. He only got this far into it. It took Jung and Adler and Fromm and Wilhelm Reich and so many other psychologists to push further back. He was exhausted. He paddled up Niagara Falls in a one-man kayak the wrong way. And as a Taurus, he got there. He pushed backwards into the spaces of the unconscious. Now, having said that, the idea that as we begin to see the external world differently, we have different ways of negotiating the stresses and anxieties in our life. We have different ways of figuring out what we want to do and what our legacy or life purpose is. I think that even just a change from the geocentric to the heliocentric, was overwhelming. People don't realize how great a shift that was. But now we've basically lost our underpinnings. This is part of the what's the word I'm looking for? The loss of feeling connected in the modern age. One of the last books that Carl Jung wrote, not his last, I think it was his third from last book, was a book called Modern Man in Search of the Soul. And it's almost like it's almost like we don't have a single center anymore. And I mean, it used to be that everyone had the same reality. I mean, at one point in time, I mean, we lived in worlds where we were born and we died, and we basically followed this trajectory. Now people's timelines are different. Their way in which they define their lives are different. This is all new. This isn't the way it used to be. The reason why retrogrades are considered difficult is that if you go back a few hundred years ago and you had a retrograde Mercury, retrogrades are louder. There was nowhere to express it. You went crazy. You projected it, and then you had bad shit happen to you, and so we moderners find ourselves in a world that is very different than the world that our ancestors were in. And it's exactly because of what you are saying. And that is that the relationship between the outer and the inner is not a top-down affair. It's not as above, so below. It's as above, so below, and as below, so above, because it turns out that our consciousness is actually like a surfer riding a wave that's created by the interference of the very small and the very large. You can't take away one without losing the other, because they are reflections of one another.
I'm with you. I want to stop just for 1 minute to kind of
Go for it.
So, as you were talking about Freud and Jung, I was like, well, so many of us are still healing from Freudian damage, all the damage Freud did. There has been, I did a lot of research on Jung, and unfortunately he's he was very anti-Semitic and didn't treat women very well. I can say that that's me being nice and kind. And I'm like, so I'm thinking about who had access to describing the cosmos. You know what I mean? So how that symbolic language was formed, is that like, are we due for an update? You were talking,
Oh, we are doing it real time and live, and you can look, at just the infusion of feminine energy into what used to be a boys' club. Remember, astrology was written by guys for guys. Sure, the girls were tracking their lunar cycles and they had a sense of the emotional, connection to the cosmos that guys did not. But when you look at who astrology was created for and by, it was basically written by guys and about guys. And so from that standpoint, we look at the work of people like Demetra George introducing not only the concepts of the dark moon, but of the feminine, of the asteroid goddesses. You look at the resurfacing of images that come from maybe 4th, 5th century AD Jewish mythology. And I'm speaking of Lilith, who then was considered to be a demon. And now she's considered to be somewhat of a saving grace. She's here to rebalance the scales. And so, yeah, I think this is happening real time, right in front of us, with us.
Yeah. And not to mention, all of the Black, brown, indigenous, trans folks, people who didn't when you said it was written by guys for guys, I also am wondering if you're alluding to how historically it was utilized for kings or for emperors or for
absolutely. And I mean, you can it's tricky territory because our mindset, our universe is different than it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago, or 1,000 years ago. I mean, you say, yeah, Freud did a lot of damage. Absolutely. Jung was to some extent maybe not the nicest person in the world. But, you look at someone like Albert Einstein, who's, just filled with brilliant wisdom, not only scientific wisdom, but Piscean, magical, intuitive wisdom. He wasn't so nice to the girls in his life either. Matter of fact, he was rather not nice. But the point here is that what Freud created is, what it is? It's like saying that Jesus, and I should say that like Ram Dass, who when asked if he was Jewish said, only on my parents' side. I mean, I was raised Jewish, but Jesus was just probably this amazing teacher, healer, magician, and yet Christianity is just, to quote George Carlin, it's the leading cause of death for, it's not a good deal. And so it was Kierkegaard, Soren Kierkegaard, an 18th century Danish philosopher who very clearly delineated the difference between Christianity and Christendom. Christianity is the teachings of this person, and Christendom became the political institution that really took a few of the teachings, but altered it all to be a political power-based structure, that had to do with the accumulation of power, wealth, and dominance, and the denial of all those feelings and urges. I mean, you talk about the suppression, whether it's slavery, whether it's the slavery of women. I mean, women, I don't need to tell you, but women, until recently, and even still to some extent, are property. They're slaves. Maybe not the people that we know, and maybe not the people or some of them that have broken out of this. But 50 years ago, 100 years ago, it was a very different situation. And so we bring to the world a very different perspective that is it's about waking up. And I'm not talking about being woke. It's about waking up from a 2,000 year sleep, a form of self-hypnosis. And the integration of I'd say alternative views, but they're not alternative. It turns out that the myth of the, let's call it the Semitic European, Western European, that whole process, that is a singular point of view. And the others aren't alternatives. The others are just as equal. They're not something that you look at as well, I don't have to be this, I can look at that also. And I think that's what we're becoming aware of. And it's totally confusing. It's so confusing that there are lots of people in very severe denial, just like not Freud, but the entire Western culture was in a suppressed state of denial that was so closed down. There was no word for ego. There was no word for subconscious. There was no understanding that dreams were about the inner world communicating to the outer world. And Freud, unfortunately, was a product of his times, just like Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, was a product of his times. And we are the product of our times in future generations. If we get there, people will look back at people who thought they were like amazing and woke and contributed all these amazing things. And they'll go, God, were they stupid? They didn't understand that granite was alive or whatever. I don't know.
Sure. Oh, okay. So, I guess your answer is yes.
It depends. What was
right? What was the question?
Yeah, okay. What was the question?
It's so funny, Rick. I'm all like, I can't remember what I had for breakfast, and Rick Levine remembers what year Kierkegaard wrote this. So I love it. So let's keep going. We're in a Hierophant year. If we're looking from like a numerological perspective, we're in a 5-year. I like to look at patterns through the lens of the archetypes of tarot. So I'm trying to speak with people who correlate to this archetype. You're one of those people for me because you're, of course, a teacher, which means you are a student. You are also a translator. You translate patterns, planetary movements, planetary energies into language for folks. You interact with, all of these different frequencies, histories, not just of astrology, obviously, but of philosophy, literature, poetry, music, so on and so forth. And so I just want to dive into this in a couple of ways with what you do. Number one, I mostly think I'm talking about your one-on-one client work, which you kind of spoke to already, and also the forecasts that you do. Like you've been doing these forecasts for ages for every sign. The output is absolutely incredible. And I'm just wondering if you have touched into the do you feel like you have certain responsibilities?
Sure. I would have quit writing dailies probably 10 years before I did. I wrote about 1,200 words a day, 7 days a week for 17 years. And I calculated that out once on Excel. I think it was somewhere around 8 million words. And of course, in the middle of that, I co-authored with my now deceased astrology buddy, Jeff Jower, 8 mass market, big, thick books of 150,000 words each. The output is there. But here's the problem is like I wrote those dailies and I have to say that I am blessed because I have a trusty editor who's worked with me for 18, 19, 20 years. And when I get discouraged, she reminded me that if I stopped writing them, someone, and in their biggest distribution, I mean, they were reaching 8, 10, 12 million people a day. And if I were not writing them, someone would be writing them without my intentions. And my intentions are always based upon what can I bring into someone's life that's not based on false hope, but that makes them understand that there are options, that there always are other ways of looking at something, that there's always a way in which we can frame something that does give us something to do, no matter how bleak or overwhelming or discouraging the picture might be. And not that I want to be a Debbie Downer, but on days when it's absolutely magnificent, it's also good to keep in mind that that may not last forever.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I was also wondering, how do you balance your personal interpretations of some transits? For example, like, you might have a particular experience of a planet or a transit that, you relate to, you connect to personally for you, right? Like everyone's got that, like, oh God, gotta batten down the hatches,
Yeah.
How do you balance your bias, your experience with transmitting this information to someone who might have a totally different experience, like Mercury retrograde? I don't want to use the word enjoy, but I kind of enjoy Mercury retro. I'm a natal Mercury retrograde. I generally have interesting things happen. I haven't had doom and gloom, me
neither ever. And my Mercury natally is direct.
And I'm just kind of like, how do you sort of take your unconscious stuff and try to put it into someone else's experience? Like you're an Aries sun. You said you're very Aquarian. That's a very different energy than, say, a Capricorn sun. Or I know everyone's chart is super complicated and different. There's many different signatures, but like that Capricorn with like a Sagittarius rising and a Scorpio moon might experience a transit depending on where it's landing, or just depending on them, right? Who they are apart from their chart. Like, how do you prepare? Like, how do you do that? I think it's difficult.
Well, again, I'm going to lean on Sigmund Freud here because like it or not, I'm sorry, but because he created a methodology that basically is, and he didn't take this from shamans, but all indigenous people without having to study modern Western psychology know how this is a basic concept. And that is, you can't guide someone through these unconscious spaces unless you know where your shit is. It doesn't mean that you don't have to deal with your shit. It just means that this is why in all modern psychologies, that a psychologist will continue some ongoing therapeutic process, some sort of peer review, some sort of ongoing thing, so you don't mess up what your stuff is with what the stuff is that of the person coming in. And I'm not saying I got this down, and I think that everyone has biases, and I think it's really important to know your biases and to acknowledge them rather than to live in this world of denial. Priests are a good example of a class of healer, therapists, guides who have historically lived in an intense world of psychosexual denial, which then translates into a fear of and or a suppression of sexuality, homosexuality, other than anything foreign. I mean, it's built into the fabric. And I think that there's no easy answer here, but it's about constantly peeling your own onion, constantly becoming aware of where you are with respect to what your client brings or what's happening in your life, so that you can always come back to the mythology. There's no such thing as objective reality.
Correct. Yeah.
But we can get closer to it by taking lots of data points that aren't bent by our singular subjectivity.
Do you have any rituals? Do you channel? Like, do you do anything to get yourself prepared for this?
I live in that space. Well, let me tell you, when I first started writing my dailies, I had no voice. I thought dailies were stupid. I said no self-respecting astrologer would ever do that. But I needed, it's a longer story, but I needed a way to get some voice out so that I could establish a base. And when I sat down that very first day to write, I realized that I needed some guides. I needed some helpers. And so I thought, okay, so who's a popular astrologer that really writes cool shit? And how can I maybe bring that voice in? And I immediately thought of Rob Brezhny. And
Free will astrology for those you listeners out there.
Free will astrology. It's a weekly rather than a daily. But so I thought about Rob, and then I realized, Rob's stuff is really cool. But if an astrologer read Rob Brezhny, they might smile. They might think it's clever. They might think it has good food for thought. It's brilliantly written. I mean, Rob is an amazing poet and he knows astrology, but there's no astrology in it. And I don't mean the names of planets. I mean that you can't read his stuff and link it to anything that's real.
Right.
It could just as well be coming from his unconscious and just bleh. And I know it's more than that, but so I said, I need another voice to balance that out. And I said, who is like an anchor in astrology that may not have the public cleverness and playfulness that Rob Brezhny has? And I thought, Rob Hand. Rob Brezhny is kind of like almost like all style and no grounding. Rob is almost like all grounding and no style. Now Rob has his own. I mean, I'm being not quite fair here, but when you read something that Rob wrote, you know why he's writing it. You know where it's coming from. And I decided that I wanted to conjure up both of these voices. And the first few days that I wrote, I would literally sit down, light a candle, and I would conjure up Rob and Rob is how I refer to them. Rob and Rob. I need you guys. Rob and Rob, where are you? Okay. Because I wanted both of those nuances. After about doing this for a week, I realized it wasn't cutting it because I wasn't packing enough into the small amount of space that I had. And the device in language, this would be, called a metaphor. And I thought, so I need more metaphor. Who's the champion of metaphor in the English language that I could possibly bring in? And I don't know if you've ever read any, but I've read every book by Tom Robbins, who wrote Jitterbug Perfume and Still Life with Woodpecker and Another Roadside Attraction and da-da-da. Okay. Tom Robbins can put 4 metaphors into a 6-word sentence and somehow make it work. I don't know how he does it. It's just like, and I thought, he goes into the Rob Brezhny side because, man, this guy can really, he's clever and he's funny and he's lighthearted, but he has meaning. I said, I need someone to balance that off. And I immediately came up with the image of Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche, as you may know, in books like Zarathustra, he wrote in what he called aphorisms. They were like, an aphorism is like a parable, but instead of told as a story, it's in 1 or 2 sentences. And in fact, in his very self-aware nature, Nietzsche said that aphorisms are written for men with long legs so they can walk from mountaintop to mountaintop. So starting then, I would sit down and I would conjure up Rob and Tom and Fred. They were my, and I did this for months and months. They were my go-to of and over time, I stopped inviting them to the party because it became my party. When I sit down to write, it doesn't matter whether it's 2 p.m. after 3 cups of coffee, or whether it's 5 a.m. after a late night of too much wine and hanging out and shit. I need to have something up by 6 a.m. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether I have pneumonia or a cold or whether I feel on top of the world. I sit down and it's like, boom, There's no ritual that I do. I'm an Aries. What I do is I do it. And that's how it works for me. And if I was a Pisces, I remember a number of years ago, I was lecturing at Lilydale. Do you know Lilydale? Do you know of Lilydale?
Yeah.
So for those listeners who don't, Lilydale is a community that was founded in the 1860s. And it's based upon the Church of American Spiritualism, which basically has one underlying concept to their entire religion. And that is that death is not an end. It's just simply a place at which we become non-physical. So I was teaching at Lilydale, and I was doing this lecture, and there's a longer story here, but I needed to cut down my slides. And I took out a couple of slides that were this wonderful poem by this on fate and free will by this poet named Elizabeth Wilcox Wheeler. When I got to that point in the lecture, it was like, I really wished I hadn't taken that out. And I had my computer set up to on PowerPoint. I had an iPad on the table, but I couldn't. I was like, what am I going to do? I really feel like I need to read that. So I picked up my iPad, and as I'm talking, I'm literally online, Googling, looking fate, free will, Elizabeth Wilcox Wheeler, and it keeps coming up with another one of her poems. I can't find it. I'm annoyed. I set the iPad down. I go on, and something says, no, you really need to read this. And I pick the damn thing up again, and I go through it, and I still get stuck. And finally I said there wasn't a large crowd, maybe, 50, 60, 70 people. And I said, I got a poem that I want to share with you, but you just need to hang on a second because I need to find it. Somehow it's not in my slides. Well, I purposefully took it out because I wanted to make it not as long. And I said, just, I'll be right back. And I found it, and I read it, and it had exactly the impact that I wanted. And I was just so pleased at myself for finding it and being kind of like Taurian enough, not that I have anything in Taurus, to do it. And I finished the poem, and the person taking tickets at the door said, "That was great, Rick. She wrote that when she was living here in 1903.
Wow.
And I had this almost like this Kundalini kind of energy from my ankles all the way back up through my legs and just went and here's where my problem is with ritual. Rather than thinking like a Pisces would, wow, Elizabeth Wilcox Wheeler has communicated with me, and I, am in touch with that, and that's really magnificent, and blah, 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 blah. And in fact, a real Pisces, when I first began to eliminate it, would have said, okay, no, but not me, I'm an Aries. And when that person said that she wrote that there, all I could think of in that moment was, I've been had.
Like she was pranking you? She was punking you from beyond?
I thought I was totally in control, and I was absolutely not. So my relationship with ritual is kind of odd. I respect it. I use it. I believe it, but I don't necessarily go out of my way to do it. It somehow, it like hits me over the head with a 2x4 every minute of my life.
So, just a little intense. So you've been practicing for decades. What is something that you wish you had learned or figured out earlier that would have saved you some time in your astrology practice?
Trick question. I don't think anything can save time. It's like
interesting.
When I learned astrology, I learned it way faster. I've always been a bit of a fast study, but for me, I never learned astrology. And I know other astrologers who have said this exact same words. I felt like I was just remembering it. It's like, and so, no, I had some really good connections early on. I think the most important things that I ever learned about astrology were not astrology. They were, because astrology is just about connections and correspondences and, learning mythology or some mythology. As a youth, I thought I knew all the mythology in the world because I thought it was all Greek. I didn't know there was anything else. Important things that came into my life like the works of Buckminster Fuller or Marshall McLuhan, people who altered my worldview that allowed astrology to become a facet in a much larger picture of how the universe is glued together. When people say, so why did you become an astrologer? I have a stock answer, and my answer goes something like, for me, the study of astrology is part of my journey to understand how meta becomes physical.
I understand. Yeah.
So in other words, there's non-existence and then there's existence. The Vedas write about this forever. But even in our human beings, we start out as two tiny specks of cells that somehow manifest the complexity of our lives, that manifest a book, that manifest relationships, people, parents, children, interrelationships. How does that all happen in some sort of patterned sequence? How does metaphysical, meaning alongside or beyond or outside of physical, how does metaphysical become physical? Because it does every moment of our existence. That's what our existence is the conversion of metaphysical into physical, and then the conversion of physical into metaphysical. It's a round robin. And so, that to me is really the magic of it all.
I have a few more questions, and if that's okay. I wanted to know if there was something in your chart that you didn't understand or that didn't make sense and that you had to grow into and understood what it was about.
Oh, sure. Every damn thing in it.
Really?
I think that what happens is that we think we know what we know based upon our experience of that time. But if you pay attention to things as your life evolves, you learn that everything that you know is wider and deeper. And so from that standpoint, I thought when I first read back when I was 21 years old and I read about Aries, I thought, I get it. Yeah, that's me. Or when I read about, the moon square sun or Neptune opposing Venus. In my chart, I have Venus opposed Neptune, not to the degree, but to the exact minute. And I thought, yeah, I get that. And the answer to that question of, did I get it? No. Do I get it now? No. But I get it more every time something happens that tickles that energy. And it's about paying attention to it. That's how we learn and that's how we grow. So, there are things in my chart that, for years, I used to talk about Tem Terechter, who was the founder of Mountain Astrologer, who passed away a couple of years ago. Tem created this fictitious character that when he was short on content, he used to run want ads, like in the personal section, from this fictitious character called Dr. Zodiac. And Dr. Zodiac did cosmetic chart surgery, like house cuspal removal. He would kind of like make the lines in your chart not as severe. He did planetectomies. So you'd go to Dr. Zodiac and for me, for years, it was, I need a Saturnectomy.
Yeah.
Saturn is my downfall. Saturn was my problem. I have natal Saturn quincunx to Jupiter, and Saturn, of all the planets in my chart, is probably the least aspected, except the quincunx and a lot of semisquares and sesquisquares. And so that's been a bugaboo for me over the years.
How's it played out? Like, how has that played out for you in your life?
Missed deadlines, bad endings in relationships that didn't have to go that way, not taking responsibility. It's just, all of Saturn's stuff. It's Saturn will get you. And Saturn got me enough times that I began to try to figure out ways to integrate it or integrate, that energy. And, but I think every planet is like that when we look at it deeply. There are no goods and bads. I'm so tired of leftovers of words like malefics and benefics and afflictions. Although some planets, I mean, look, Saturn and Mars are harder to work with than Venus and Jupiter.
Why do you say that in your experience? Just your experience.
I mean, I am a Marsy person just because the energies they play less well with others. Venus is ameliorating. It's soothing. It's sweet. And Mars.
Well, not when you get her riled up.
Well, no, but or yes. But that's the same is true that when Mars softens, he becomes an absolute protector of all those things that are gentle. That's my point, is that the benefics are not good. They're just easier to deal with when you're in the course of least resistance. You see, most people go through their life like water flowing downhill, and that is the water will find its way to the sea.
Yes.
Course of least resistance. Now, that person who knows how to work the nuances of the energy through yoga, and I don't necessarily mean sitting in postures. I mean the etymological derivation of the word yoga is the yoke of an oxen. And those people who know how to yoke, to harness that power of the bovine energy of the water buffalo or of the ox, that person can learn how to build maybe little beaver dams so that they can divert some water for irrigation, or maybe eventually Grand Coulee Dam. And I'm not saying that these dams are good for nature or even, but they're building up Saturnian structures so that the energy can build up and then bring out a charge like a capacitor in an electric circuit, rather than just willy-nilly, finding its way to the ocean. And most people don't know that there's anything to do other than to just be who they are and end up in the ocean. So planets have their course of least resistance, as do charts. And Jupiter is just gentler in its course of least resistance than Saturn. Typically.
How did you integrate your Saturn more?
How many times do you have to get hit over the head? Actually, one of the things that I do, because I have so many planets in cardinal signs, and for those people who are listening who may not understand, there's basically every action has 3 layers. It begins, it continues, and then it transforms into the next. And the cardinal, which is the beginning, is the person who's always waiting for a wave, like a surfer, to surf an external wave and see where it goes. Whereas the fixed person will never surf a wave unless it's the wave that they know where it's coming from and where it's going, and it's going their way. So as someone who has a lot of cardinal energy, I find that the best way that I can incorporate Saturn is by setting myself up in a situation where I have to write 1,200 words a day, 7 days a week, and that becomes a yoga. What my personal proclivity is, or if I'm wanting to take a few days off or whatever it is, I can't, or I have to do it a few days ahead. But now what I've done is I've shifted the responsibility, even though it's still my shifting the responsibility, to an external source, because that's what cardinal people do. If I don't want to, I was going to say drink or smoke, but neither one of those matter, because I always have a lot of wine and I don't drink much of it. But there was a time where if I had pot and if I had marijuana, I smoked it. And the only way for me to not do sugar or flour, this used to be that way, was to get it out of my environment. Not so much these days, because I think as you grow older, you learn it. What's that Pennsylvania Dutch line? We grow old too soon and smart too late, Yeah, that's how I've incorporated Saturn. I've done a lot of leaning on. I was intelligent enough to get myself into relationships where my partner had strong earth, or strong fixed energy to counter my cardinal energy and or my fire air energy.
Beautiful.
And so, yeah, so I think that there's different ways in which we attack it, depending upon how we work with the energy. I mean, I remember that there were times when back in my 30s or 40s where I would get all bent out of shape and my partner would just say, be still. And that person was a Leo, Sun, Scorpio, Moon, and knew about holding their energy. Meanwhile, I'm a Gemini rising and it was like, it would make me crazy because being still wasn't the solution. It was being in motion in a healthy way. That was my solution. So again, this comes back full circle now to, we can't just assume that our answers, even though they may be the absolute best answers for us, are necessarily the right answer for anyone else.
I love that. I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the signature astro of 2021 before we close.
Yeah, I want to say it's easy, but it's not easy. It's complicated. It's basically the dance between Saturn's two home signs, Capricorn and Aquarius, which really have to do with the dance between Saturn as the status quo, especially when it was in Capricorn for the last couple of years. And now Saturn moving into Aquarius, but being 90 degrees on and off all this year, and really even through 2022. Yeah, through 2022, is this dance between Saturn and Uranus. They're square. The exact square is today, February 17. Saturn and Uranus are making their first of three squares. Their final square in 2020 will be on Christmas Eve.
2022?
No, 2020, this year, 2021. But then what happens is that they come within a degree of each other again, but they never actually match back up exactly. And that's in November of 2022. And so even though there's lots of surface noise, even though there's lots of things going on, the underlying theme is the dance, or let's say the conflict, the 90-degree angle, the stress created by fixed Saturn, or Saturn in fixed Aquarius, let me put it that way, and Uranus in fixed Taurus. Uranus wants change. Uranus wants to blow the whole thing up. And I don't mean physically, I mean metaphysically. Uranus just wants to nuke all the boundaries and just be in wherever it is that we're going to be next. The problem is that in Taurus, Uranus doesn't like to change. And a Taurus is like Newton's third law. It's an object at rest tends to stay at rest, and an object in motion tends to stay in motion. But Uranus and Taurus is like trying to get granite to change. And granite doesn't change easily. But when it reaches that breaking point and when it has to change, that's a massive earthquake. So we have Uranus in Taurus. And I have an image that Rob Hand, I don't remember whether I heard him say this once or whether he wrote it somewhere. But when talking about Saturn and Uranus, it's like an irrepressible force, that's Uranus, meets an immovable object, that's Saturn. And so we have an irrepressible force that right now doesn't really want to change, but knows it has to. That's Uranus and Taurus. And that's squaring Saturn, which is an immovable object, but it's an immovable object that's already planted in the future. That's the social structure. You see, we're moving from Capricorn, which is hierarchy. Saturn, as a ruler of Capricorn, is about the rules and the laws and everything having hierarchy. That's why the mountain goat climbing to the top of the mountain and the sea goat, which is the dolphin, going to the absolute depths. That creates a spectrum, and Capricorn needs, and Saturn in Capricorn needs that spectrum of hierarchy. And we've seen that with Pluto in Capricorn for the last years, and that whole rush through 2020, we've seen those structures begin to be stressed and fall apart and disintegrate. But what's happening now is that as Saturn moves into Aquarius, Saturn says, I know what the rules are, because remember, the ancients, the Saturn was also the scientist. It was the person who knew enough about the rules. It was the magician who knew enough about the rules that they knew how to break them. And so we have Saturn in its form that really now has been somewhat taken over by Uranus, because we moderners have kind of put Saturn out to pasture in Aquarius. But this dance is a dance between the old and the new. It's a dance between the status quo and what comes next. It's a dance between our tradition and our history and what we know we need to do now. And this is what's going on in every aspect of currency, of economics, of politics, of power struggles, of international. That's what's going on. That's what we're experiencing. And it's not going to be an easy dance. It may not be 2020 all over again, but there's a very deep rhythm. And this is being fed really by what happened in the 2012 to 2015 range when Uranus was squaring to Pluto. And so we're in this continuum. This is an extraordinary moment in history. And even on days when it sucks and days when we think, I can't believe that just went down. This is a time that if humanity survives, this will be as an important moment in time as the Magna Carta or whatever.
Well, we are really coming full circle, because this just gets me thinking of what you said first about bending space and time, and this like very weird looping where we have like Saturn and we have Aquarius and we have Uranus. So we have this technology, we have innovation. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about maybe it's like kind of like what you were saying earlier about your personal experience with Saturn. Like, how many times do we need to get hit over the head? Like, with technology, how many times do we need to see the same photo? How many times do we need to be reminded that like certain things aren't working? Like, how many times do we need to be grieving? How many times do we need to like have this? And so we have this like technology is giving us this very odd sense of time, because humans historically have never had this much technology and this much access to what's going on everywhere in the world. And we're seeing these patterns much more quickly, on all levels.
This is a really deep discussion, but there's a poem, I come back to poetry, by one of my favorite 20th century poets, E.E. Cummings. And E.E. Cummings wrote a poem called Plato Told Him. And it's very short, and it goes like, and it's exactly what you just said. It goes like this. Plato told him he couldn't believe it. Jesus told him he wouldn't believe it. Lao Tzu certainly told him, and General Yes Ma'am Sherman, and even, believe it or not, you told him, I told him, we told him. He didn't believe it. No, sir. It took a piece of steel off the old 6th Avenue L in the top of his head to tell him. In other words, we don't get it. And we get it finally when someone close to us dies, or when we have some great loss, or when we have a piece of steel lodge itself in our head, or when we get an incurable disease, or when our whole worldview disintegrates by something that happens that we experience either personally or see on TV or learn. So, yeah, I mean, it's about time loops. Time loops are an amazing thing. And you see, this gets back now to the illusion of linear time. You know, when you see a client, and I think that in my client sessions, the most powerful tool that I have is something that I learned from Grant Louis, who is a early mid 20th century astrologer. And I've also heard Rob Hand lecture on this. But when I heard Rob lecture on it, I'd already been using this technique, and I thought, Rob likes it too. It must be good. You know, and for those people who don't know, Rob Hand is one of the great astrology minds on the planet. The technique, though, is about following Saturn throughout our life. And I'll just give you a quick example. You can take Saturn in its relationship to your ascendant, or maybe to your sun or your moon. And Saturn is going to make a rhythm where it lines up with your, let's say, the moon. And then about 7-8 years later, it squares it. And then about 14 years later, it's opposite. And then about 21 years later, it's squared again. And then it lines up with it again and again and again and again. And I have my students go through their life and map these out, because they are earth-shattering. When you realize, for example, when you were 3 years old, you had your only sibling born, and you lost your dominance with your parents. At age 10, your dad lost his job and you moved to a new city and you didn't know anyone. at age 17, 7 years later, you had your first love and it was terribly overwhelming and confusing and it put you into a depression. At age 24, you met a person who you married. And at 7 years later, at age 31, you get divorced. And you follow this around. And what people realize is that they're all the same event. There's one event, but we see it through this fragmented time loop of now. And it's an extraordinary, oh my God, I didn't realize that my parents got divorced on this date. And then my mom remarried and I hated living with her. And then I got into this relationship and then we separated and then we had kids with someone else and then we got divorced. And I'm just using the marriage divorce thing because it's easy, but it's movement. It's whatever your personal story is.
Sure.
And so, yeah, now the power of now to lean on Ram Dass, Be Here Now, or Eckhart Tolle, the power of now is that's all there is. But in the moment of now is all the Saturn and all the outer planets, for that matter, that have bumped the same energy again and again and again. You see, we don't move through time. We're holding still. Time moves through us. And it's the illusion of time because, as the Buddhists would tell us, everything that's ever happened and everything that ever will happen is happening now. We just don't get to experience it all simultaneously.
It has been such a pleasure to get to spend time with you, Rick. Thank you so much. I'm going to put this all in the show notes, but do you want to tell folks where they can find you?
Google Rick Levine.
Yeah, you're like, just Google me.
Actually, it's at Rick Levine Astrologer on Instagram. And on Facebook, it's facebook.com/Rick Levine Astrologer. How original can I be? And on Patreon, it's patreon.com /Rick Levine. But any of those places will find me, for better and or for worse. I seem to not be able to escape my social reality. Life has eclipsed my individual life, and the two shall ne'er meet.
Well, it was such a pleasure, and thank you so much.
Yay. Can we do this again sometime?
So that's our show for this week. Hope it gave you some food for thought. If you want to learn from Rick directly, sign up for his Patreon. Follow him on all social media. The links will be in the show notes, or take one of his courses. Lots and lots of love, moonbeams. Until soon. Bye. Moonbeaming is brought to you by The Moon Studio. It is created and hosted by me, Sarah Faith Gottesdiener. It is edited by the incredible Caitlin George Parker. Additional support is by Stella Hartman. Music is by Will Owen and myself. If you like this podcast, you can support us by going to Patreon /The Moon Studio and becoming a patron. You can give this podcast 5 stars wherever you listen and also subscribe. We'd love it if you could let 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or more friends know about us, and we accept all good vibes. Thanks so much for supporting us. Witches on planet Earth, not flying off to Mars.